like to talk today about an incident in terms of policing on Long Island here. In terms of the assault that happened in a police station, apparently there were two officers who were involved in the assault of a woman of color who was stopped in Wyandanch in 2017, so 4 years ago. The woman was a passenger in a car driven by a male friend to visit her stepmother. So she was going in this car to visit her stepmother, and they stopped. They wanted to go into a delicatessen. They wanted to get some breakfast sandwiches to eat, so they pulled off and they got the breakfast sandwiches. And as they started to drive away from the delicatessen, they were pulled over by two policemen, Officer Mark Pav and Officer Christopher McCoy. There was no violation. Therefore, there was no reason to pull the particular vehicle over. It was just they stopped. They saw these people in the car, and they decided, well, let's pull them over. One of the concerns that a lot of residents have raised, particularly residents of color here on Long Island and really throughout the country, is that sometimes they are pulled over without cause just because of the color of their skin. So, and there seems to be a case of that because there was no violation. They weren't speeding. There weren't, the typical thing, a tail light out. There wasn't any of that type of situation. After questioning the two individuals and running their information through their criminal database, the officers found that the woman had three warrants for what we call non-criminal offenses. Two stemmed from driving without a license, and the third involved occupying a housing unit that lacked a Babylon Town rental permit. And the woman had thought that she had satisfied these warrants, but apparently she hadn't. So Officer McCoy ordered her out of the car, and he placed her under arrest for these outstanding warrants. When she was taken to the station, she was sexually assaulted by one of the officers, McCoy, who forced her to perform oral sex on him twice. She had previously been raped, but she was not believed by the police. So this time, she spit some of the semen from McCoy onto her sweater so that there would be proof of his actions. And this was a way certainly of defending herself, because in the previous incident, nothing was done. Police just did not believe her. McCoy's partner, Officer Pav, did not intervene, and he assisted McCoy by completing some logs that McCoy had neglected, and he knowingly falsified entries in the log. They had to log different times and what was going on with the suspect, and McCoy had neglected to do that, and so we asked Pav to fill it in for him, and he filled it in falsely. McCoy took this woman into a room that was supposed to be used only for juveniles and had no windows with a view to the interior of the precinct and no cameras at that time. So there was, obviously, he was isolating this woman, and this woman should not have been in this particular room in this precinct to begin with, because it was restricted to juveniles, so it was inappropriate. There were other officers who were observing this at the time, not only Pav, but others. And of course, the question is, why were they allowing this? Obviously, it was a breach of protocol. McCoy was charged. He spent a year in prison. He is barred from serving as a police officer again. The plea bargain that he agreed to reduced the charge from a felony to a federal misdemeanor of depriving the woman of her civil rights. So the charge was reduced in this case. Pav was not charged. None of the supervisor or other officers in the precinct were charged. Now, this leads to some observations. Would this officer have been held accountable if this woman did not have compelling evidence, the DNA of Officer McCoy in her possession? Because the charge initially, it seemed like, was going nowhere. And then the woman produced the sweater, and all of a sudden, it was like a different story entirely, and it therefore was then taken seriously. So this woman hadn't had the presence of mind to take the action she did. This most likely would have really gone nowhere. It was just her word against his word, and she's a suspect, he's a police officer, it's going to go nowhere. So what this leads us to observe is the inequity in terms of the justice system here. And we can always say, of course, this is just one bad apple, and these things happen, and of course they shouldn't happen. But this is not symptomatic of police as a whole, and in many cases, certainly there are so many fine officers and wonderful police personnel who would not engage in any of these terrible activities, obviously. So, but the overall problem is uh, the idea of the police officer taking advantage of his status in this situation. Uh, does this incident portray a culture of acceptance of illegal acts among police personnel? And why it raises that question is that the actions of McCoy were kind of public actions in the sense that they took place in this precinct. It wasn't, in a place where others wouldn't be observing it. The natural thing is, why is he taking this woman into this room? What's happening? This is not supposed to be doing this. Um, and there was no resistance to it at the time, or really, until afterwards when the woman produced the evidence of the act. The DNA clearly indicated it was McCoy. So, it raises the alarms about the situation in general, and the fact that the officer Pav was not charged, even though he was involved and really abetted the incident, and that other officers who were around were not charged with anything. You say to yourself, is there a culture here among the police of accepting these types of activities? And so it just raises that question. I mean, of course, this might be something that's isolated, rarely happens, and hopefully that is the case. But certainly it raises certain alarms to us about acceptance of things that obviously should never be accepted.